Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age, and I'm Jim Goodale. We've got a great show for you tonight with Dan Rather. Now, we all know Dan Rather has left CBS News, but do we all know he went to HDNet? He left broadcasting for the mass audience to narrowcasting for the few that can have HDNet. Can Dan do that? I think I know the answer. But the issue tonight is, can Dan go digital? Dan, thanks very much for coming by.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Jim.
I want to share with the audience the promo that HDNet has for you that's on the internet. So let's roll it.
Dan Rather reports on HDNet will be different. First of all, we have no entanglements politically, corporately, or any other way. We are independent with a capital I. We'll be able to go in more depth because we don't have time constraints. We're not tied to the ratings. We're not tied to demographics. We're not tied to advertising. That our mission on Dan Rather Reports on HDNet is to do quality news of integrity.
That was a very interesting promo that you have there, because it, raises a question: what kind of show you're going to have, how you're going to do it, where it's going to be, how we see it, and we're going to ask you those questions. But I think maybe the most interesting question of all for me was, when you think about all the wonderful things you're going to be, it effectively says, I was none of that, or at least the networks were none of that. So I'm going to be an improvement of what went before. So are you dissing the networks with that quote?
No, it wasn't intent to diss the network. We're emphasizing the positive. It wasn't either my intent nor HDNet's intent to criticize the networks in any way. I worked, and proudly so, at CBS News for 44 years. I was anchor and managing editor of the evening news for 24 years. And so when one says, well, here's a criticism of network news, I have some responsibility and some accountability for my time there. But the larger picture, and I think one the public needs to understand, I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but it may either have escaped their notice or they haven't concentrated on much, that the acceleration of the pace of change in news in general, and particularly in electronic news, has increased tremendously in recent years. And we have what I've called the corporatization of news, particularly network news, but of news in general. Ever larger corporate entities who are intertwined with their needs, their overall needs for legislation in Washington, influence with regulators in Washington. And
making money.
Making money, nothing wrong with that, delivering stockholder value. And it makes them even more conflict and controversy adverse, which is not always healthy for the public, for people who consumers of news. So that's one thing, and the pace of that has picked up quite a bit. The fact that entertainment values, which have always threatened from the beginning of American television to overwhelm news values, it's almost complete. That Ed Murrow was talking about this problem in the 1950s, but it's got increasingly worse.
Can I just stop you? Somebody said you went and saw that show, movie on Ed Murrow 6 times. Is that true?
I've now seen it 7 times.
7 times.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. And I find it inspiring.
Yeah.
And if that strikes somebody as corny or a little puzzling, well, so be it, but I find it inspiring. But Murrow was talking about the threat of entertainment values overwhelming news values back in the 50s. By the time we got to the turn of the millennium, I think by any objective analysis, entertainment values were very close and are breathtaking close now to completely overwhelming news values in sort of tsunami fashion. Now, with network news, and we could see this coming from way back, having been warned about by Murrow, and we did our best. We made our mistakes, and as I say, I'm responsible and accountable for mine. But we're now at a point where particularly network news, but electronic news in general, is so focused on, number one, demographics. Ratings no longer matter as much as demographics, that is the age of the audience and the ratings themselves, that the undertow, the pull, the undertow tide against news as has been defined and in favor of entertainment or quasi-news or infotainment is very large. Now, in going to HDNet and doing Dan Rather reports, I have complete, total, absolute editorial and creative control. This is unheard of in my experience.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody had it
Right.
before, but I don't know they had
Oh,
it
in
now.
fact,
So all of
yeah.
these things are the reason I say that we can do quality news on HDNet the way that maybe a lot of people in network news would like to do it, but can't do it.
Okay, so as part of my answer, can Dan do it? Obviously, you can do quality news. I mean, that's no one's going to say you can't do a quality news product. At least I'm not going to say it. But here's a question I have. You've been doing a quality news product, at least on the evening news, for a huge mass audience, okay? And it just seems to me you can't do that. I mean, you can't say courage to the, maybe you will, I don't know, to the HD net type. So you've got a narrow casting, probably pretty high, pretty upscale audience. HD net, by the way, is on channel, at least as we speak, 724 on Warner Cable. So you're going to have make the investment in all that, and get to the end of the channel, watch the quality. So I have a question: how you take your experience in dealing with the news of the evening and translating it to this audience. I mean, I'm suggesting maybe you can't do it, but I'm not really suggesting that seriously.
Well, can't is not in my vocabulary. We can do it, and we will do it. I have no illusions that, at least in the beginning and probably for a long time, certainly we will be viewed and listened to by a much smaller audience than was the case with the CBS Evening News. But that's part of the point in going. Just, my life is about news. I'd like to think even those people who dislike me or have something against me for one reason or another will acknowledge I've spent my lifetime in news other than the time I spent in the oil fields. And I'm dedicated to news, and I do want to do, I ache to do, I yearn to do news of integrity. Now, how many people see it, what the demographic makeup of that audience is for the first time ever in my experience, was always before I worked where ratings were important.
Yeah.
They're no longer important to us. Demographics are not important.
Right.
The important thing is to do quality. When someone says, how are you going to adjust to the digital? Can Dan do digital?
Can Dan do
and
digital?
I say, well, check it out.
We'll
do it, and we'll do it well.
But what are you going to do?
It will be to a smaller audience.
So what are you going to do?
Well, initially,
briefly, because I know
a
you got a lot
1
of-
hour weekly news program. It will begin
Tuesday
October
night?
24th on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock.
And but I mean, when I turn out, it's an hour, right?
An hour.
So I mean, I would think that turning that on and then realizing you're not going to give me the news of the day, I would expect to see something segmented like 60 Minutes. And I would have thought maybe your 60 Minutes experience might be more relevant to this than your anchor experience.
Well,
Now,
I think the 60 Minutes
am I right
experience
about
will
that?
be. I think the 60 Minutes experience will be more relevant. However, we are not trying to do 60 Minutes.
You're not trying to do investigative stuff?
Oh, no. Investigative stuff is at the very heart of what we're trying to do. We do investigative stuff, and I love to do investigative reporting, and we do as much of it as we possibly can. But we will also be able to provide context and perspective. You said before you won't be tuning in to get the news of the day, and that's a good thing. But where much of electronic news, particularly, and increasingly print news, is short, it's in giving people background, context, and perspective. We'll be able to do that. But the core of our program is going to be investigative reports, hard-edge field reports. I would love to have been on the Lebanon-Israel border at the time Hezbollah began firing over.
It'll be like 60 Minutes a little bit then.
Hard-edge field reports, and interviews.
Oh, well, it sounds to me a little bit like 60 Minutes, Dan.
Well, it's not going to be 60 Minutes. We don't see 60 Minutes.
A little bit like it?
Well, we hope it'll be better. 60 Minutes is a very good program, but we hope it'll be better. But again, and I take a backseat to no one and admire my friends and colleagues at 60 Minutes and what they've done and what they've accomplished over the years. But they know, whether they will say so or not, that the undertow I talked about
is there too.
To meet entertainment values and to do more sports and celebrity things. They know that that's there, and they know why it's there. And I do too. It's because of demographics and ratings.
This is a small audience. I mean, how are you going to do this? Most people need producers. Are you your own producer too? No.
Yes.
Oh, you're your own producer too?
Yes, but
you're
naturally
busy.
you have to.
But you have some other producers,
I prefer
right?
to call them reporters. I want every person in the house, from the person who sweeps the office up, to be a reporter.
But where are you going to get the staff? This is going to take to do a really good piece on the Lebanon border. I mean, you got to get there by plane. It's probably got to be a charter, doesn't it? Probably.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Probably better if it were.
Yeah.
You want to take a few people along with you.
Well, let me just cut through.
Where are they all going to? Where's all this going to come from?
Well,
and you want to be competitive with what you were before, which means that you're going to have to, staff up a little bit. You're going to have to staff.
Well, we're in the process of staffing up.
Yeah.
And what I've been told by Mark Cuban and Todd Wagner, who principally Cuban, who runs this part of the operation, is that you'll have what you need. And
Really?
I'm happy to say that when he first said that, the first thing he said that really stunned me was, listen, and he leaned forward, you will have total, complete, absolute creative and editorial control.
This is because guy owns basketball teams, doesn't he? How do we know about him?
He owns a lot of things.
Including a basketball
But the
team.
most important thing to me is that when he said that, I really got interested. And when he said, you'll have what you need. We have been hiring people. We are hiring people, but staff is not a problem. The biggest problem is to meet our high standards. And whether we can do that or not, we'll start learning pretty soon.
You have to have good editors, too.
We have to have everything.
But what are you going to do now? Don Hewitt, who is a producer of 60 Minutes, in my view, is one heck of a producer. What always amazed me about Don Hewitt is he'd run the piece on 60 Minutes that Dan Rather did, but he wouldn't look at it. He'd turn his back to it and see what it sounds like. Well, I'm not asking if you're going to do that, but the point of my reference to Don is, well, there's a highly sophisticated extra person who is thinking about Dan Rather's program. I mean, it's going to be hard to get, it's going to be hard to do all those things, isn't it? I mean, if in fact you're at the top of the pyramid.
Well, listen, I have no illusions. This is exciting. It's very interesting to me, but it's also daunting. We're trying to climb a high mountain, and it's all straight up the north face, and I know that. And it's a risk, but I think it's a risk worth taking, and I think we can do it. But to your point about having checks and balances built into the internal system of the broadcast, we have that, and we'll increase that as time goes along.
Well, talking about producers, one of your one of your producers in times past was Mary Mapes. And so I want to change the subject a little bit, come back to what we were talking about at the end, and talk about Mary Mapes and the story on George Bush's tenure, or lack of tenure, in the National Guard in Texas. It's been reported that Mary Mapes would be a producer for Dan Rather. Is that wrong, that report?
That's wrong.
That's
Absolutely
wrong?
Not true.
I did a show with Mary Mapes. At the time, she wrote a book in which she described what had happened to her in producing the show that led to all the furor about the issue of the authenticity of documents that were used on your program. And I wonder if we could just use a clip from my show, and that'll give us a way to talk about this. But I want to ask you, if there's no provable forgery, if the documents were true as far as we can determine, why were you fired?
Well, that's an interesting question.
So that's why I asked.
I guess in the report I was cited for myopic zeal, which I joke in the book was always one of my good points. As an investigative reporter, you got to have a little myopic zeal, or else you're going to a long time before give up. So I guess I was fired for zealously or tenaciously pursuing a story that ultimately made CBS and Viacom feel financially uncomfortable.
You were fired for making Viacom feel. Why did it make them feel?
Well, what I was told at the time, one of the executives told me, Mary, do you know how many millions of dollars we spend lobbying in Washington every year, and nothing you've done in the past year has helped?
I want to ask you whether you would agree with Mary Mapes why she was fired. Now, I find it interesting that at the top of our show, you talked about the corporate needs in a variety of ways, including dealing with Washington, I think you said, but in any way, making money, so forth and so on. So I just want to make that as a reference, and I'm not trying to push you to agree with Mary Mapes because of what you said a few minutes ago, but this gives us a can opener to talk about this. And I want to tell the audience and remind you that I've written a piece in which I attacked the investigators of this piece, who wrote a huge 300-page report. I I never got into the issue of forgery. I want to talk about it a little bit with you. I just thought their methodology was wrong. And so full disclosure. But now, is that why Mary Mapes got fired?
I don't know.
You don't know why she's fired?
I don't. So much of this whole chapter remains puzzling to me, Jim. I have tried very hard, and I think succeeded in putting CBS in my rearview mirror as I take on this challenge with HGNet. And what I have said and what I have to say about that whole period, including Mary Mapes, and I want to make very clear that Mary Mapes was a terrific producer, is a terrific producer, and she's a very good person. And I've taken a lot of heat, perhaps it's justified by sticking by her and with her. But as Martin Luther said in a whole other context, this is where I stand, I can stand no other place, about her as a person. So much about this whole thing is puzzling. And who I am is that it's behind me. I find most people worried about the Iraq War and how they're going to put their kids in college, not about what happened to Dan Rather and 60 Minutes too. And for those who are still actively thinking about it, they pretty much got their minds made up. Now, until and unless, and it could happen, that there are other developments, then history is going to have to judge how well we did it, how the company handled it, and I'll live with that judgment.
Well, here's the thing that, I mean, I think many people have it in their rear view mirror, and I can understand that answer. I spent an inordinate amount of time going through this, and it's in some respects in my rear view mirror to accept that I'm puzzled by it. I may have spent more time on that report than probably anyone else.
Well, you spent a lot of time on it.
I'd be very surprised. I mean, there's 300 pages I went through it, and I got angry at the report because the report you would have thought was there to determine whether it was a forgery, and it couldn't conclude that it was a forgery. So why write a report? So since then, I didn't ask myself whether it was a forgery because I didn't have enough to get at it. I've been asking myself, well, Jesus, was it a forgery? And well, I want to ask you, was it a forgery?
I don't think so.
You don't
there
think so?
There are others with other views, and I respect that,
yeah.
Except those who come from partisan, political, or fervently ideological standpoint.
Yeah.
But here's what the report said. Keep in mind, we're talking about a report put together by a group that was handpicked by the company, and some of the people who were supposed to be investigated had a hand in picking those who were going to investigate it, and put an exclamation point beside that. But here's what they concluded. Number one, they did not find, it didn't conclude there's any political bias. That's number one. Number two, they concluded that they could not determine. They spent a lot of Viacom's money and a long time, many months. They could not conclude that the documents in question were forgeries or, for that matter, were not authentic. And that was their conclusion. Now, there are a lot of questions to be asked about this group that did the investigating. But again, and I find myself, I want to look forward, I want to go forward with what I'm doing. But the one thing that I think gets missed so often in reporting this, even by people who think, well, gosh, the report was okay, is that with the documents, and there's no desire here to get into an argument about it, but there's no dispute that the content of the documents are accurate. They're absolutely accurate, the content. The only dispute is, well, okay, those who don't like it say, well, the content's there, but we think the documents were not authentic. So I think it's important to note that what was said in the documents about the president's service, and for that matter, lack of service, is absolutely true. It's the question centered on, the attack centered on, whether the documents were what they purported to be, that is, either documents or copies of documents.
Okay, so I think another shoe is going to drop on this because the source was Bill Burkett, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. No one knows where he got the documents. Somebody's going to find it. Someone's going to break him down and find out someday. So I think there's sort of a missing piece to all this. The other part that really fascinates me, and it's this. These documents came out in a particular series of time. Mary Mapes, on her own, did a FOIA request and found other documents that fit the time lapses of these documents.
Yes, and they're still missing documents.
And they're still missing documents. If it's a forgery, how did the person who forged them do it in a way that it didn't overlap with documents that, as far as I know, the only person who knew they existed was Mary Mapes. I mean, I just don't.
Well, as I say, I agree with you
I don't
that there
understand.
may be other developments as time goes
Yeah.
along, and if they are, then it may change the perspective of what was done and why it was done.
Well, I've got to ask you this question. I know you won't put this in the rear view mirror too, and we'll put it there, but were you treated shabbily?
You have every right to ask that question, Jim.
Well,
and
that's
I
what
hope
I'm
you
supposed to
respect
do.
the fact that I say that I'm not
Not
going
gonna-
to answer.
You're not gonna answer
Other people need to answer that question. When you're in the vortex of something such as this, you can't be totally objective about yourself.
All right, let's go back to the beginning now. We're trying to figure out how your new show relates to network news, and you've talked about it a little bit. A lot of people think that network news, where you used to be, is now going to be personality driven. And that if you look at the background of the present anchors, you have Gibson, who came over from ABC, Good Morning America, is that the right program? And of course, Katie Couric. And that for it to be viable, it's personality that counts, and not so much the fact that you slogged out being a newsman. I always like the story about Dan Rather the best, when he covered a hurricane and strapped himself around a telephone pole and reported the hurricane from the middle of the hurricane. But the issue is that going to be the future of network news, personality driven?
It will be personality driven to a point, and let us note that it has been, that Ed Murrow was a very big personality. But this is what I talked about with entertainment values threatening to completely overwhelm news values. I think it's inevitable that it will move more in that direction. But having said that, I want to point out that Brian Williams came up the news way at NBC News.
Brian Williams did, right?
And Charles Gibson was a correspondent there before he came. And with Miss Couric, that her father was a newspaper man. She was a street television reporter for a while. So I'd be a little reluctant to jump and say, well, it's going to go all personality driven. I think the more important question than who is the anchor of the news is what the content of the news is. And unquestionably, that's become more entertainment and personality driven.
If it's personality driven, it's going to be more entertainment. You know, someone said to me that to be really good as an anchor or a TV personality, you only can have one personality. And I don't know if you want to bite on this one, but it seems to me Katie Couric's got two personalities. In other words, she's got Katie Couric, who's so much fun and perfectly good as a straight news person. Can someone with two personalities succeed on network news?
Yes, I think they can.
Really?
I
So
do.
you don't think that's
But
you can have two
I
personalities?
want to point out.
You only have one, though.
Well, that's my choice.
Yeah.
I'm a reporter. I'm a lifetime reporter. It's the only thing I ever dreamed of
Tom
wanting to do.
Brokaw's only got one.
But I will say this, that there's a transition period to make for people who've been doing one kind of program and they come to another program. Being an anchor is a leadership role. And I think anybody who comes to the anchor chair, particularly for one of the major network programs, will have to exert themselves as a leader, define themselves as a leader, and also define that they love covering news. And anybody who does that, I think, has a very good chance, not only internally with their own staff, but with the audience.
Okay, now I want to ask you whether, this is a real softball question, whether you think the future of news is in so-called deep cable. Let me explain what deep cable means. You actually use it in the promo. You want to get deeper into stories. You told us at the top of the show, now you have time to get below the surface of the story. Tom Brokaw recently did a program on environmentalism on Discovery Channel, and Ted Koppel did a show also, I think, on Discovery. And there's been commentary in the press that deep cable may be the way the news is going. Now, add to that PBS Evening News. That's not a cable show, but it's deep. And then the absolute extraordinary phenomenon of NPR. 22, 23, 24 million listeners all doing, it's not deep cable, but deep journalism. Do you think that's where the future is, and these other shows will be, painting, so to speak, that you look at and like, but and you're
Well,
entertained
I
by
think
it?
the short answer to your question is yes, which is to say, for news as it used to be defined, and as I would like to define it, increasingly cable is going to be the place to find it. Now, there are all kinds of podcasting and other ways to do it. The internet comes into play here. But I think the short answer is yes.
Yes. Okay, so we've come to the end, and it seems to me that what we've proved in this show is that Dan Rather can not only do digital, he's on the cutting edge of where the news is going. Do you agree with that, Dan Rather?
Well, of course I agree with that. Dan can do digital.
Dan can do digital. Can you do Dallas?
That's a different matter.
Well,
you, Chuck.
thanks very much
Not
for
at all.
coming
Thank
by,
you for
Dan.
doing this. Thank you.
And thank you for coming by, and come by next week and learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I want to say courage. James Goodale, good night.